Good morning, APUSH Nation. Leewan and Farhan here, and we're doing Going Green, Modern Environmentalism.
Yeah, so first we're going to start with a quick recap of the 1900s, stuff we've talked in class, that kind of thing. We're going to start with Theodore Roosevelt and his early 1900 conservationist policies. One of these acts was the Reclamation Act of 1902, which basically built irrigation systems throughout 20 arid states, including Arizona, which is how we got all of these wonderful canals everywhere. And also we have the American Antiquities Act in 1906, which set aside millions of acres of land for use of federal national forests.
Continuing this progress, Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s had his alphabet soup programs. One of them was the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, and which provided young men with jobs that were conservation projects. On the nature side of things, we have the Dust Bowl, which was due to over-farming of the Great Plains region, which led to eroded soil and infertile land.
Yeah, so then we also had President Johnson in the 1960s. High on President Johnson's agenda during the Great Society were environmentalist reform. Johnson pressed for an expanded national park system, improvement of the nation's air and water quality, protection for endangered species, stronger land use planning, and highway beautification.
Well, and also Johnson also passed the Wilderness Preserve Act, which designated 9.1 million acres of federal land as wilderness areas, barring future roads, buildings, and commercial use. He also passed the Air and Water Quality Acts, which set tougher air quality standards, required states to enforce water quality standards for interstate waters.
So now we're going to move on to the modern environmentalism movement, which really picks up and piggybacks off of the 1960 counterculture movement and hippie movement. The impetus that really ignited the environmentalism was Rachel Carson and her book Silent Spring, which of course demonstrated the harmful effects of the pesticide DDT. In addition, in the 1970s, Earth Day was created, which we celebrated like a week ago. An idea sparked by a massive oil spill in Santa Barbara, California. And Earth Day was an idea to raise awareness of environmental issues and really kind of allow the public to better understand environmental issues.
So, in the 1970s, the United States experienced an energy crisis, which caused the gas prices to jump by 40%, and mile-long gas stations stretched while the patrons waited for hours for fuel. And this jump was due to an oil embargo, which staged by the Arab states of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This jump led to an increase in purchase of smaller and more fuel-efficient cars like Toyotas and Nissans, and less of so-called gas guzzlers made in Detroit. And the environmentalism movement was spawned out of this realization of limits on Earth's resources.
Yeah, so also you should just know a couple of important environmental organizations. Greenpeace is definitely one of them, but also the Sierra Club, which was founded in 1842, the Wilderness Society, which was founded in 1935, and in 1942, the Natural Resources Council. So catalytic events in 1969 that really kind of also jump-started the environmentalist movement was Santa Barbara drilling oil rig spill, and the Cuyahoga River near Cleveland, which caught fire because there were flammable chemicals floating on top. And Friends of the Everglades organization, which opposed an airport that threatened plants and wildlife in Florida. So these three events also kind of catalyzed the environmentalist movement.
Under President Nixon's administration in the early 1969, following the Santa Barbara oil spill, the Congress passed the Environmental Protection Agency Act, which led to establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, and led to that the agency passed new laws that like the Clean Air Act of 1970, and the Occupational Health and Safety Act also in the 1970s, and the Water Pollution Control Act of 1972. Then there's the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Well, these acts, not everyone was pleased with it because large corporations and workers believed it would be obstacle to their work and further productions.
Yeah, so they basically thought that the new laws would restrict their production, like their output, and also the workers thought that it would restrict their ability to get jobs. So we're going to shift a bit to nuclear power now, where basically many Americans actually greeted this technology with open arms because they believed that it would produce no air pollutants and be much more efficient. And by 1974, the U.S. was already operating 42 nuclear power plants since its arrival in the power industry in the 1950s. So just in this almost 2-decade span, 42 nuclear power plants across the U.S. But environmentalists actually took a different view, contrary to what you might think. They publicized the dangers of nuclear power, such as with reaction meltdowns and the dumping of radioactive waste byproducts. One good example of this was the 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor facility near Pennsylvania, which drove the point home when it experienced a near meltdown, causing the displacement of over 100,000 people for fear of their lives. And a speedy shutdown managed to save the public from catastrophe, but the government did not authorize further plants to be built until much later. Today, however, 20% of the United States electrical power comes from nuclear power, which gives us 4th ranking in the world in terms of nuclear power.
Go nuclear.
Woo! Alright, so now transitioning from the overview of the 1900s we were giving to more specific policies implemented by presidents, from Gerald Ford to present-day Barack Obama.
General Ford, he was a really big advocate of the environmental system, environmentalism, and he put a lot of effort into the movement. He assigned $4.5 billion of the national budget to the EPA and promoted clean lakes and an increased sewage system, in addition to this for the implementation of Safe Drinking Water Act. And also he put $1.5 billion into the increase the size of the national park system.
He also put in additions to the National Wilderness Preservation Act, and also worked on Forest and Rangeland Renewable Resources Planning Act of 1974 and the Bicentennial Land Heritage Act. So now we're going to move on to Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter actually, he did deal with the energy shortage, and he dealt with it by establishing a national energy policy and by decontrolling domestic petroleum prices to stimulate production. He also prompted government efficiency through civil service reform, and he proceeded with deregulation of the trucking and airline industries. But mostly he did seek to improve the environment. His expansion of the national park system included protection of 103 million acres of Alaskan lands. He also installed solar panels on the White House roof in an effort to help the White House in going green. So we're going to move on to Ronald Reagan now.
Okay, Reagan wasn't really that much of a supporter, as unlike Gerald and Carter. He was actually pretty much against it. In 1983, he ordered mass resignation of EPA officials, and in 1996, he dismissed this acid rain proposals as burdensome to the industries. And in 1991, he established
California established OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, but over Reagan's objections. He really did not want that to pass.
Interestingly, Reagan actually removed solar panels from the White House that Carter has installed previously.
But then in his second term, he significantly increased the EPA's budget and added acreage to the National Wilderness Preservation System. And he added animals and plants to the endangered species list. So kind of half and half here. It's a bit different. So I'm going to talk about George H.W. Bush now. That's first Bush. He was president from 1989 to 1993. So he was an environmental president, and he actually campaigned off of being an environmental president. He worked on the passage of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which was, well, as it implies, amended the Clean Air Act, and the original, which was passed under Reagan's administration in under Nixon's administration in 1970, and it's renewed in 77. Bush also appointed the first professional conservatist to be the head of the EPA. And in his first year in office, President Bush announced his version of the Clean Air Act, and his support helped get the bill passed. But in addition to that, in his first term, he had to deal with the Valdez oil spill, so the Exxon Valdez disaster. It was basically a massive oil spill. Millions of gallons of oil spilled into the ocean off the coast of Alaska in March of 1989. And that actually created more favorable environment or atmosphere for the passage of this bill. And it gave the American people and legislators more favor the bill. He also regulated pollution. He was central to the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which were basically limits on urban air pollution like smog and toxic air emissions and acid rain. So, President Bill Clinton. So although Clinton does get a lot of flack for his Monica Lewinsky affair, he was an environmental president. He campaigned partially on a platform of environmentalism, and although he chose a somewhat amnesiac vice president, Al Gore was a staunch environmentalist. The Clinton administration approved new Clean Air Act standards for soot and smog. He also took action to protect waterways and water quality by launching the Clean Water Action Plan, strengthening the Safe Drinking Water Act, and permanently barring new oil leasing in national marine sanctuaries. He also vetoed numerous anti-environment bills that Congress seemed to be very intent on trying to pass. In August 3rd, 1993, President Clinton issued an executive order requiring federal agents federal agencies to report to reduce pollution as much as possible and to report to the community any toxic chemicals that are released into the environment. So that kind of demonstrates that Clinton was very active in environmental policies in both federal issues and domestic issues. Then we move on to George W. Bush. He's not a very big environmentalist. Instead, he promoted big business for benefit of the economy. But he does have some policies, such as policies that helped reduce air pollution by 12% between 2001 and 2007 through stringent air quality standards. He also helped prevent wildfires through the Healthy Forest Initiative and, of course, others, but primarily he wasn't too big of an environmentalist.
So then our next president, Barack Obama, our current one, Obama was a pretty big supporter of the environmental movement. Obama works closely with the EPA, and on June 2014, they released the Clean Power Plan, which is the first ever carbon pollution standard for existing power plants, which will put U.S. on a path of 30% carbon reduction by 2030. He also expanded and modernized the electrical power grid. In 2014, the administration announced a strategy to reduce methane emission, which methane is a potent green gas that builds The plan builds on progress today and takes steps to further cut methane emission from landfill, coal mining, agriculture, and oil and gas systems. The president is also working with the EPA and the NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, to assess the impact of climate change in the global environment. Okay, now, so we're transitioning now from the government policy to the private sector. We'll now discuss the general innovations in alternative energy and green technology. So we'll start with a quick overview of the early 1900s. One of the first alternative energy technology appeared in 1908 when Henry Ford created and mass-produced the Model T, which was the first flex fuel car. So it meant that it could run on both gasoline and ethanol. And then in 1920, California built the world's first geothermal power plant that ran on its numerous geysers, with the first commercial scale plant in 1960. In 1970, the government passed the Geothermal Steam Act, which leased government land for geothermal development. Just 6 years later, wind turbines became commercially available in the U.S. and were truly advanced by participation of the federal government with NASA. One of the largest scale government projects came in 1935 with the completion of the construction of the Hoover Dam in Colorado, here in Arizona, which became the largest hydroelectric power plant in the world. A little over a decade later, the government passed the Atomic Energy Act of 1946. This greatly encouraged the development of nuclear technology. Although still completely monopolized by the government and heavily exploited for military use, as we mentioned earlier, nuclear power exploded into the American public in the 1970s, but was later diminished as environmentalists revealed the potential dangers of nuclear power and of this technology to the public. And the 3 Mile Island meltdown was really a big scare. But the first nuclear generator was built in Idaho in late 1951. After the first development of the U.S. in 1954, passed another Atomic Energy Act, which advocated for the use of atomic energy for peaceful purposes. Okay, so in the 1950s, petroleum became the most used fuel in America, while natural gases have become more widely used with construction of pipelines in several cities. Back to the energy crisis that we discussed about OPEC and the oil embargo, we know how this dependency on gasoline blows up in the U.S. face. As the energy crisis developed, people look for the source of power, and in 1953, Bell Laboratory created the first silicon solar cells. This new technology allowed for the development of solar power, as we know it. And in 1958, the U.S. launched the world's first satellite with solar cell capability of harnessing power from the sun. But more affordable and viable ground-based solar cell were developed in 1970s, and the solar power commercialization, reliability, and visibility was demonstrated in the construction of the Solar 1 and Solar 2 in 1981 and 1996, respectively, which were large solar powered tower plants. And an interesting fact here: the first solar powered village was here in Arizona, in the Tohono O'odham Reservation.
Pardon his Native American.
Speaking of space, in 1960s, General Electric developed a hydrogen fuel cell for most of the Gemini missions, with the safe byproduct that's also useful in space: drinking water.
The 1980s saw several important events that affected the growth of national alternative energy, such as the first wind farms and the solar thermal power plants. But also the Chernobyl meltdown in Russia, which was one of the largest nuclear meltdowns ever. And also, in 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil spill became the largest in U.S. waters, which was in Alaska, which killed thousands of animals. As we come to the 21st century, as you know, there is a large increase in public awareness of alternative energies. In early 2003, President Bush supports the Hydrogen Fuel Initiative in an effort to accelerate the advancement of hydrogen alternative fuel. In 2008, in Kingston, Tennessee, the worst coal ash spill in U.S. history occurs, in which some 300 acres were covered in sludge containing various harmful chemicals, including arsenic. Then in 2010, the BP oil rig explodes and causes the worst oil spill in history. And in 2012, the EPA announced the Clean Air Act for regulating of carbon emissions by power plants. In 1997, Toyota unveiled the first commercially available hybrid car in Japan. This led to many car companies following a similar trend and the production of an all-electric car. In 1999, Honda released the two-door Insight, which was the first hybrid car to hit the U.S. mass market, and in 2002 released the gasoline-electric Honda Civic Hybrid, which we all kind of hate. And in 2000, Toyota released the four-door Toyota Prius, the first four-door sedan available in the United States. In 2008, American gas prices reached a record highs of over $4, which caused a shift in American car production from CUVs to smaller and more efficient cars. In 2012, Tesla Motors released the Model S, a fully electric sedan that demonstrated its environmental potential and prowess, while still maintaining the appeal of a sports car for daily use. This sums up modern environmentalism from the 1900s to the present.
Well, this concludes our presentation for modern environmentalism going green.
Goodbye.
And good luck on the APs!